This is Saturn Girl. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. Comment below because I want to know what you think and it helps me out with the algorithm. Also do me a favor and click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And my videos are the best. Yes. Also, we've just started up YouTube memberships and we have tons of really cool perks. So please check it out. And also my new bumper stickers arrived. Yes. Please support my campaign to make astrology sexy again. Yeah. I'll send you a free one if you email me. All my information is below, and pledge to put it on your car or your vehicle and send me a picture because this is for promotional purposes. I'm a shameless self-promoter. Well, anyway, what I want to talk about today is even more fun and exciting. You see, we're starting up a whole new series of videos where we're going to explain and explore what a planet means through the various houses, yes, in your chart, whether it's a natal or a transit. We're looking at both. Now, for those of you who don't remember, transits are where the planets are in real time. Okay? Okay. And of course, since I'm Saturn Girl, we're going to start with the planet Saturn. Yeah. My malevolent matriarch. And why do I refer to her as such? Well, because of a famous ancient astrologer named Dorotheus of Sidon, who was born around the year 75 AD, right? So a long time ago, right? And he had listed Saturn as one of the female planets in his famous work, Carmen Astrology. Everyone should check it out. Yes. And making Saturn feminine makes more sense to me because it evens out, right, the ratio of male to female planets. Yeah. So you got the Sun, Jupiter, and Mars on the one side with the male stuff. And then you got the Moon, Venus, and now Saturn on the other side. I just like it because that's how I relate to Saturn myself. You know, it's my personal relationship. I know everyone who follows me knows that Venus / Inanna is my mama, right? But Saturn Girl now has two mommies. I have two mommies. Modern astrologers also often refer to outer planets as transpersonal, but I prefer to think of Saturn as trans-feminine. It's probably a little bit of projection going on there, yeah. But from here on out, I'm going to refer to Saturn as she. Anyway, this first video is all about Saturn in the first house, in both natal charts and transit. So let's talk about this, please. Because what's Saturn mean in astrology? Well, number one, Saturn often signifies what? Delays, deception, long struggles, isolation, right? He's the furthest visible planet. Melancholy, grief, loss, labor, and hard work. Also authority, management, and control. He rules old things and therefore tradition as well. And old people, old Saturn girls, right? I don't look old, I just feel it. Anyway, therefore the natal house we find her in will show us where we have our primary struggles in life, where we have a sense of loss, and where we need to apply the most effort, and also where we feel the most authoritative, stubborn, and perhaps even controlling. In a modern sense, I often approach the natal house that Saturn is in as representing the area of life in which we find our primary psychological issues. Yes. I think of it as where we store up our trauma, suffering, and fear, and often symbolic of events that happen before our Saturn returns. For example, I have Saturn in the 9th house. Yes. And most of my issues, regardless of what they are, funnel down into my primary struggle with God and religion. Yes. Well, Saturn also takes about 29 years to round the zodiac. So she'll remain in the sign for about 2.5 years, which means she'll transit that corresponding sign, that whole sign house in your chart for that same duration. Yes. That house will show you where you experience the most setbacks, delays, struggles, and also where you are putting in the most effort, perhaps building up and even manifesting things. So Saturn isn't all bad. She makes us do stuff. Remember that these are only general observations. And the condition of your natal Saturn, meaning dignity and what else, matters a lot in how you subjectively experience these events, these transits. Yes? For more information on Saturn's meaning in astrology, you can watch any one of my videos that has Saturn in the title, because I probably explain quite a bit. So, now what's the first house signify? Well, you know, crazy modern astrologers, they often call it your appearance or your mask, which is a very sort of myopic and terrible understanding of what the first house is. You see, it's the whole you. Mind, body, spirit. Many ancient astrologers referred to the first house as the soul or the life breath. You see, the rising sign was the sign coming up or rising over the eastern horizon as you took your first breath. And in many of these ancient Hellenistic cultures, that's where the soul was considered to have entered in. It represents you, as I said, and the rising sign may be regarded as your essential nature. So yes, it encompasses your body, sure, but also your personality, your individuality, and your essence, if such a thing exists. Now, when I see Saturn in the natal first house, a few things come immediately to mind, and they all sort of have to do with authenticity. Saturn deceives us, and in the first house, she deceives us about ourselves. And this manifests in a number of ways, right? Number one, codependency. The first house, and really the whole sort of eastern half of the chart, which is over here. Look at this chart, everything's over in the east. And here we have Saturn transiting the first house. So right now, Saturn's in Pisces. So for all of our Pisces rising friends, this is especially relevant to you. Anyway, Saturn, in this area of your chart, right? The first house and the eastern half of your chart have to do with individuality and independence. And Saturn here often confers what? A lack of self-value. There's usually a fear, right, of being abandoned, which leads us to seek our value through other people, right? Now, these people, Saturn in the first house people, they often long for the sense of living happily ever after, but typically what they get instead are unhappy endings, and I much prefer happy endings. But that's another story. But they'll enter into relationships with few to no boundaries. And what are boundaries? Well, as I always say, they are what you are willing to tolerate. When we don't have any boundaries, we're passively telling others that they could do whatever they want to us. And then we feel trapped in these relationships because we're too scared to leave. And when you're too scared to leave, you allow yourself to be treated like a rag doll. Jane says she's done with Sergio. He treats me like a rag doll. Jane must have had Saturn in the first house. I mean, for those of you who are 90s babies or rock fans like me. But you see, we'll keep trying to fit ourselves into a box of other people's expectations, rather than just being authentically ourselves. And oftentimes that has to do with the underlying fear. So the big lesson here is what? To put our attention on our strengths and our virtues. What is it that you do well? I know you do something well. Everyone does. And that's where our self-valuation comes from. It comes from accomplishment, right? Because Saturn makes us do things. And you only get confidence from actually doing things, not just talking about them. As us air signs love to do. Right? You'll never find your value through another person. Only through yourself. And once again, that's very Saturnian, isn't it? It's a very Saturnian realization. Now, a famous person who comes to mind in this whole sort of connection is Brittany Murphy. Brittany Murphy, I love you, my darling. Rest your soul. Oh my gosh, Brittany. Well, before she passed away, she found herself in a very toxic and apparently abusive relationship with producer Simon Monjack, who was allegedly using her for money and, according to what I read in Teen Vogue, blew through about $3 million of her money, right? Pretty wild. He was terribly manipulative, and even according to some of her friends, didn't even allow her access to her own phone. I mean, that doesn't sound like the fertile environment in which to explore and be your authentic self, does it? Well, we also see melancholy or depression, yes. Mental and chronic illness that are associated with this. You see, the same sense of fear and lack of self-worth lead to a depressive demeanor, don't they? Part of the depression comes from not feeling like one is able to be their authentic self. Like we're trying too hard to fulfill everyone else's expectations. Or at least what we think they are, because we're just making stuff up in our heads, aren't we? Natives with this aspect in their charts have a natural inclination towards self-deprecation, right? And even dark humor as a coping mechanism. So making jokes about yourself, making fun of yourself, right? So it's a little masochistic, right? But a little masochism never hurt anyone. Except for me. In a good way. But the primary enemy here for these natives is hopelessness. It's the sense that nothing better will come. That there's no dawn after the darkness. But we must remember that things are always changing, always moving, always in flux. I think of Britney Spears, my other mama, right? As an example of the first house Saturn, who struggled with these sorts of issues. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and has struggled with depression her whole life. From a very early age, she had to constantly do what others expected of her. Her success and her accomplishments were sort of ripped away, weren't they, by her parents. She repeatedly went through abandonment in relationships, and she suffered terrible postpartum depression after the birth of her children. Of course, right, you need therapy for this sort of thing, and medical treatment, right? I'm bipolar, and I'm on medication, and have wonderful treatment. So it can be done, and you can live I almost said normal, but mostly normal-ish kind of life. I mean, I've never been all that normal. Of course, you need therapy and medical treatment, but you also need hope. Yes, you need to look forward to things. Saturn is about the harvest, right? He's often, in the male, I call Saturn she. But we see Saturn often depicted as an old man holding a scythe, right? Which was used to reap the wheat, the harvest. So you see, Saturn is also about achievement. We need goals, don't we? We need positive things to work towards. Being inactive exacerbates the depressive demeanor. And it exacerbates the hopelessness. Another signification of Saturn is what? Restraint or imprisonment. And my girl Brittany was basically imprisoned by her father in a conservatorship. Her autonomy and individuality were literally held hostage, weren't they? Of course, restraint is another key word for Saturn in the first house. We talked about struggling with inauthenticity, of restraining ourselves. But life often presents us with confining circumstances as well when we have Saturn in the first house. It's sort of like life conspires to make things hard for these people. I'm sorry, but it's sort of the way it is. They often are held captive by physical or mental health, as well as, we previously discussed, or by material circumstances that are beyond one's control, whether it's money or whatever. This creates serious people who are on a mission. Speaking of restraint, though, I would be remiss if I didn't mention another famous first house Saturn native from history. Harry Houdini. That wasn't his real name. I think his real name was Eric Weiss, but that's how he was famously known. And he very literally embodied the symbol of overcoming Saturn's restraints by becoming an escape artist. In fact, Houdini began his performance career as a child trapeze artist at the age of 9, which is interesting because I think of circus folks as sort of outcasts, right? Ruled by Saturn. It's like one of us, one of us. Gooble gobble, gooble gobble. Yes, he became famous for overcoming Saturnian restraint and confinement, breaking out of all these elaborate contraptions. But he also became famous for his Saturnian skepticism. He made an additional career out of exposing so-called psychics and mediums who he viewed as preying on the grief of others and their losses, which is sort of cruel in order to make a buck. Grief, loss, skepticism. Sounds pretty Saturnian to me, doesn't it? Well, in fact, Houdini had planned to write a book with H.P. Lovecraft, debunking religious and spiritual miracles. It was supposed to be called The Cancer of Superstition. Oh my goodness. A man after my own heart. Everyone knows I'm a very incredulous lady. So, now skepticism is a good thing, isn't it? Especially this day and age, when everyone is making shizzle up and blasting it through echo chambers on the internet. But a mind that is already made up is closed to future possibilities. Our goal should be to seek truth as it is, not as we expect it to be. And by assuming that everything is a scam, right, we may miss the childlike wonder that is available in any experience. But I'm preaching, Well, what about Saturn in transit through the first house? What does this look like? Well, I should know about this one. I came out as trans during Saturn transiting my first house. When Saturn enters our first house, she immediately challenges us, primarily physically in the beginning. We often develop health conditions or have to struggle with the pre-existent one. And it typically aligns, or at least how long we struggle with it, aligns with the 2.5 years that Saturn spends in our rising sign. If you do have a chronic health issue, you can pretty much expect it to get worse while Saturn is in your first house. For example, I have a chronic health issue, and it got a lot worse while Saturn was in my first house. I had been dealing with it, undiagnosed for years, but things took a turn for the worst, and I couldn't manage it. I was missing work. It was really bad. But this put all of my focus on that issue, well, mostly. And towards the end of the transit, I was finally diagnosed, and my doctors worked with me on how to manage my condition. And remember, for those of us who were born at night when the sun was below the horizon, when it was dark out, Saturn can be more difficult. So it was a more difficult, challenging experience for me. it may not be that difficult for you, right? On a positive note too, besides getting better with my condition, we often lose weight. I had great abs while Saturn was in my first house. Now I have a pooch, and it's not fun. But the emotional reaction we often have to this health stuff usually entails a greater awareness of our mortality. That's right. While Saturn transits our first house, we become morbidly fascinated by death. Well, not always morbidly, but we begin to feel the inevitability of it, the reality of it. It begins to dawn on us that we are getting older and that one day we will die. And each breath we take brings us one breath closer to our last one. First house Saturn transits make us feel older too. Sometimes we start to notice ourselves aging, like gray hair, wrinkles, aches and pains. But more likely it's that we get grumpy. Like grumpy old men, Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. No one remembers that. I love that movie, Grumpy Old Men. During my first house Saturn transit, I noticed all these little things, but it was the fascination with death that took over for me. The reality of my death began to set in. I took an example from one of my gurus and I practiced an exercise where I would imagine and put myself through the experience or the sensation of dying, and my best to imagine the cessation of consciousness. I really recommend this to everyone too. Everyone needs to read the essay by G.I. Gurdjieff called The Last Hour of Life. It details this exercise, and it's been one of the most important spiritual practices I've ever encountered in my whole life. I'll put the link in the description so you can read it. It's really good. But suffice it to say that what I became most aware of by confronting the reality of my own death was that I was even more afraid of life. You see, the fear of life hides behind the fear of death, and it is so much more insidious. It is so much more paralyzing. Now, psychologically, we begin to feel more mature, serious, realistic. We also have to face parts of ourselves that we've avoided. Could be old hurts, traumas, things that we've allowed to restrain or imprison ourselves. Most of these are surrounding or have to do with our sense of authenticity. We become aware, right, that these things have sort of become a weight upon us. The ironic thing about first house Saturn transits is that they often erode boundaries when Saturn represents boundaries. And that is, erodes the boundaries between what we think we are and how we really are. This can be very uncomfortable. But when we try to alleviate our discomfort by seeking validation or attention from others, we end up suffering even more, because that won't salve or satiate the pain. You have to face yourself on your own. It reminds me of the movie, one of my favorite movies, The Never-Ending Story, where the lead protagonist, Atreyu, he has to face himself in this magic mirror and the reality about who and what he is. I'm not going to give it away. In my experience, though, this transit serves to break up the stagnant, stale, and crystallized understanding that we have of ourselves. Like I said earlier, I came out as trans during my first house Saturn transit. I knew I was trans since I was at least 5 years old, but I didn't really have a way to describe it. Coming out was one of the hardest and yet most rewarding things that I'd ever done in my life. In facing my own sense of self-loathing, I realized why I had such little confidence. Because I wasn't being me. I was living in a mental prison of all the expectations I had acquired from myself and, life. In feeling my own death and mortality, I finally recognized how useless these expectations are and how much they were weighing me down, right? Like, cement shoes, going on a boat ride to sleep with the fishes. It was the most liberating experience, but it's also been a struggle and a process. But you must see the joy of these Saturn transits because it's what? It's the joy of accomplishment, of hard work surmounted and completed. You see, as Saturn reaches the last 10 degrees or so of a sign, we start to see some light at the end of the tunnel. You have to remember that. It's like that after having struggled for nearly 2 years, we feel how persistent patterns of thought and behavior have held us back. And we actively start taking responsibility for them. It's another Saturnian word, responsibilities. Hopelessness may be a Saturnian word, but Saturn also gives us hope. She gives us hope by showing us that effort and struggle bequeath to us the rewards of achievement and understanding. The trick, though, for these transits is to not lose hope. Saturn transits may seem long, but remember that everything changes, and yes, even mountains move over time. Yeah, Saturn threshes us, makes us face hard truths. But that's what helps us get over the self-deception about who we are and what we're really like. So that eventually we're able to live more authentically as ourselves. Well, I hope this is all useful. Please like, subscribe, comment, and click the bell. Check out my other videos. I do loads of horoscopes and educational content. Please also consider becoming a YouTube member of my channel. We have wonderful perks like extended monthly horoscopes for each rising sign. And also please consider donating through my Patreon or through YouTube Super Thanks and help me keep creating amazing content. I'm pretty funny and I'm very cute. You got to love it. All my information is below in the description, so please. I also do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website or email me. Once again, all my contact information is below. But most importantly, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a spectacular, whatever it is you're having.